everyone, today we're going to learn how to crush cans, or really any thin hollow object. To get started, we're going to do a quick breakdown on how to set this system up. Firstly, we're going to get our geometry in Houdini. Then we'll prep the geometry for Vellum, so that's essentially just a remesh. Then probably the most important part is to set a custom attribute that maps the areas of the can that are strong and the areas that aren't strong. Then we'll move on to simulation, where we go over collision geometry as well as setting our constraint and solver settings. Lastly, and this is kind of an optional thing depending on what resolution you're simulating in, we're gonna go over point deforming a high res onto our simulated geometry, allowing us to kind of do our simulation with relatively low resolution geometry and then essentially upscale our geometry right at the end. And then right at the end I'll just run through some quick problems, namely if you're having issues with the point deformer and issues with like creating the attributes and stuff like that. And yeah, so let's get into it. Okay, so starting off, let's pop down a geonode. I'm going to dive in. Let's just rename this Can Crush. I'm going to go in, and first things first is we want to import our object, right? So obj object merge. And this is how I did it, because I modeled my can in Houdini, but other ways you can import is by using a file node. If you're importing this will import most file types pretty well. The only thing I would say is if you're importing an alembic, I tend to import alembics via file import alembic scene. You can also import other ones here. If you've got FBXs, you can import them here through that. When you do this, it gives you a bunch of settings, so you can set whatever your frame rate. If your alembic has animation on it, which for this, we don't need. But if it does, you can set your frame rate and stuff here as well. This tends to also drop it as an outside source, so you'll probably import it through that method, and then use your object merge to import it into this node section. Yeah. But yeah, let's import our can and continue. Okay, let's import our can. I believe that's the one. Let's just double check. Yeah, it is. So this is my can. It's not the best topologically, but it will do. And we're gonna remesh this anyway. So first thing I do is an attribute delete, just to clean up the geometry. So we're working with pretty much just what we need. We want to keep our position, and we want to keep our normals and our UVs, and we want to delete non-selected. So we keep those parts and we delete everything else. So to begin with, we had a bunch of other stuff like distance, direction, centroid. We don't want those. We just want to keep our UV, normal, and our position. Right, then we want to, let's just stick a null here, and we'll just call this our can out can, because we're going to split this into two separate versions. So at first, let's just stick with our remesh. This is prepping it for our simulation. So we have triangles. You can see it's pretty bad right now, and the reason why is because we just want to up this just so we keep as much sort of detail as possible without like kind of having too much. And I tend to harden UV seams here, and what that does, you can probably see, where our UVs are getting kind of messed up here, it just kind of keeps them, basically it just keeps the seam where it should be. When you remesh it, it kind of messes the seam up, so it messes your UVs up as well. So this just kind of makes sure that that seam stays how it was before it was remeshed. And then I tend to do this. I tend to harden edges group. And the idea behind this is that you want to set this to edge mode, and you want to kind of get the areas where you want to keep a lot of detail. So in this instance, it's everywhere where there's like a sharp corner. I tend to grab a couple of those. If you shift and double click, it will give you a better selection. So I get a couple of those, I get a couple of these. I tend to get 1 or 2 of these guys. And it doesn't really matter that much, you're just kind of grabbing areas where you want the detail to remain. I'm probably overkilling it, but I'd rather more than have issues later. So I think that's what I tend to do here. I'd also probably, the topology on this bit's terrible, so you'd have to go in it properly, but for now it should be fine. And then we just push enter. It actually turned out alright on the top, so didn't have to worry too much about it. Yeah, so you can see we've kept our detail in these areas, whereas before, if I remove that, you'll see like our detail died up here because it's trying to keep the same triangle length, but when you do the edges, it sort of ignores those areas and keeps them high detail. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this over, and we're going to make a higher res version. This will be for later when we do our point deformer. So I brought this down to 0.1, just so it's a lot more high res. You could probably get away with making your low res even lower res, like a 0.3. But I found like the sim time isn't enough for me to really worry about this, and this is why I said you don't necessarily have to do a point deformer, because the sim's actually not that slow where you can just kind of leave it and it will do it in quite a decent amount of time. So you could, like, if you really wanted to, set your normal one to 0.01 and have the same result and not have to point deform it. But as sort of like a rule of thumb, it's always best to sim with a low res and point deform afterwards. As long as when you're simming, you're not having the point number change, because that's a big no-no when it comes, because your point deformer won't work, right? So yeah, if you're using like a VD bead thing and it's moving, like it won't work because the point numbers will change and the point positions will change constantly. Or if you're VD being after the sim, I should say, sorry. But yeah, we've got our remeshes. Then, and this is up to you as well, we can add a point, a pin group. So let's do a group, and this is for our sim. So we can, like, if you don't do this, what will happen is the can will shift and move from its position. And when I did this, I wanted the can to stay exactly where it was and crush from top down. So if you're okay with the can kind of like shifting and moving or like tilting up, then you don't have to do this. We just want to set a point group. We'll call it pin. And I tend to be quite dirty with this. I would recommend what you do is do a bounding region and move this down to the very bottom. right? Like that's one way of doing it. I did it the super dirty way, which is just moving to the front and just selecting the very bottom, pushing enter, and then we have a bottom pin group. Another tip with your groups: if you name this pin, and in your group you name this $OS, this refers to the name of the actual node. So if you middle mouse click, you can tell, it will tell you exactly what this is referring to. This is called pin. So this group is actually named pin, but because of the group on the top of the node, right? I find that's a great one to use, just to keep the actual node tree itself being more readable. And then after this is where we get into making our custom attribute. And like I said before, this is the most important part of getting this can to crush how a can would crush. And the thinking behind it is, when you crush a can from the top down, there are areas of this can that tend to not deform as much as the rest. So if you've ever crushed a can from the top down, you'll notice that the first area that gives way is the central area. The top and the bottom are fairly rigid and they keep their shape pretty well. And we're essentially just going to try and recreate that in the form of an attribute. So what we're going to do, and there's loads of ways you can do this, right? You can do this with a mask from geometry, and have a shape that fills in that area. But the way I did it, again, like the super cheap, dirty way of doing it, and probably the most art directable way, is to do an attribute paint. Where is it? Paint. There we go. I always do that. Attribute paint. And this just gives you sort of a viewport tool. So if you click on your little gizmo, we can now sort of paint areas where we want there to be a higher value. So in this case, when we paint, it goes red being very strong, so a 1, and anything else, so blue, and this gradient here is values lower than 1. So essentially all I do is I just go around, paint, and it doesn't have to be exact, right? Because it's nothing in the real world is exactly perfect, so kind of don't take too much care in doing this. Obviously we don't want those there, because we're gonna add some variation to this middle section anyway, but we just want to get a rough idea of these areas being really strong. And you can spend as much time doing this as you want. Just a note though, when doing it this way, what you'll find is if you do change the resolution of this later on, you'll need to redo this paint, because this is working off of the points. So if you make this a higher res mesh, you've increased the amount of points there are, and this paint will mess up, right? Because it's when you paint it here, it's referring to the points, the amount of points that's already on it, but if you up the resolution, you've changed that. So you'd have to repaint it. So yeah, let's just paint this, and I'd say that's fine, be perfect for now. We've got our paint, this is good. We can then, what we want to do now is we want to add some sort of slight variance in the middle. We don't want this to be a complete 0 all the way around. We want to add what I tend to do, I just added a noise to this, right? So we can just add an attribute noise. Attribute noise. We want to set this to a float, and we want to name this the same attribute that our paint is. So we want to name this mask, and you can already see it's adding a new value on top of this, and because this is already 1, it's not going to add. Oh well, I should clarify. We're going to do a post process, so we're clamping the out of this to be 0 and 1. So if we didn't do this, this red value would be, there'd be areas that are more than 1 in this, right? We don't want that. So we're just going to post process this node, so it's clamping it to 0 and 1. And then all this is fine, positive. This is where you can kind of art direct this to be whatever you want, right? I tend to turn it down a bit and bring the element. I think I selected simplex for this. Fractal's also got some good things where you can change how rough and soft you want this to be. Can bring this down so we've got less areas. And just play. I think 0 centered's actually better because we get actual areas that are 0. So yeah, just play with it. We do want some areas that are 0 because we want areas that are able to bend a lot. And you see we're getting some areas that aren't perfect up here, but again, this isn't enough of a difference to really matter. If you're getting issues where this is bending a lot more than you'd want, then yeah, change it. Change it back to positive. But this is the idea, right? We're just trying to create some variance in the middle. And you can play around with this as much as you want. I think I'm gonna leave it at that for now. And yeah, that's our mask. And this is just creating some variance in our structure. So next step is to move on to sort of the solver settings. And this is pretty straightforward, but there are some very important parts to keep in mind. So we're going to start making some Vellum constraints, right? And for the collision geometry, let's start with collision geometry because it's pretty self-explanatory. This can be anything. However you want to crush your can, this is the means in which you crush the can. So for now, I'm just going to keep this visible. If you control and click on the little template, it will give you a full detail. Whereas if you just click, it will give you a ghost. Control click gives you full visibility. Essentially a second view flag. So what we're going to do is we're just going to bring this up. I did this animation from 0 to 75, I believe. So we go here, and then we're just going to bring it down to maybe there. You bring it down to whatever height you want your can to be finally crushed at. So we just have a simple animation of this going down and crushing our can. Yeah, and if you didn't know how to put a keyframe, it's just you just alt-click on whatever part you want to animate. Cool, that's our collision geometry done. Now, for our first constraint, what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple things. First thing is we're going to set our thickness. And again, if you watch my last video, all this is it's referring to the thickness of our material. So I think I set this to quite a low number, 0.0025, because I felt like that was a comfortable thickness. This is probably too much, but I wanted to give them enough space in between. If I did want to extrude this later, it wouldn't be too much of a problem. Okay, so we've got our thickness on our can. Next thing is we want to set this to, there should be one called struts, surface struts, that's the one we want. So we've got our surface struts. Now what this does, if we, where's the button? I guess we can just do this. If we do a null. If we look at this, this is essentially just giving us a bit more of a structure to our can. Normal struts, what normal struts will do is they'll go from this side of the can and they'll make a structure going across to the other side. So they'll kind of give it more horizontal structure, whereas this is just giving structure throughout the mesh. And for some like when I was testing this, without this, it doesn't look right. I think it's just because it gives our cloth more rigidity, which is what you want in a can. A can doesn't just like flop around like a bit of rubber. It's firm, and then when you crush it, it kind of crinkles and deforms. So this is super important. We're also going to, in this, we're going to add our pin group. So we're just going to take our pin, keep our pins. I also changed the mass, although upon testing, it doesn't really change much. I'd set this to a density of 1. But yeah, it doesn't really do much, so you can probably leave that default and it not really do much. And I just upped our neighbor distance to 4, just so we have a really dense amount of constraints keeping this together. You can see it upped the amount of constraints holding this thing together. Okay, and probably the most important thing, and we're going to match this on all of our constraints, is we're going to add scaling to our stretch stiffness. And what this is going to do is we're going to input our mask that we created here. And we'll do this for every constraint because we essentially want all of our constraints to be running off of our mask attribute that we made here. So our next constraint is going to be a cloth constraint. And we're just going to connect these, Vellum cloth. If we look at this, it's just going to be a mixture of all of them. But our cloth, pretty much the same settings, right? But we're gonna set these to unchanged because we've already set these in the node above. We've already set these in here. We don't need to do a pin group because we've again already set them above. But I mean, I think we can anyway. It won't make a difference. And again, let's just start by, we want these to be set by our mask or scaled by our mask. Both our bend and our stretch. So we want to use plasticity for this because what we want to happen is we want, when this to deform, we want it to change its rest. So we don't want this to deform and then kind of want to move around. We want it to deform and stay very rigid. So as soon as it's deforming, it becomes more rigid and it stays in the position that it's in. That's where plasticity comes in. We want to set these and we just want to set our threshold low and we want our rate to be really high. So 10, and then just our hardness really, really hard. Right? I think those are pretty much the settings, but we want to do this for the bend as well. So again, plasticity, threshold 0.1. I think I did 0.01. Oh no, I did 0.1. 10, and again 1000. Yeah. Okay, let me just double check I got all the settings right. I also added compression stiffness is here. I set this really high. And yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, those are my settings. Cool. So yeah, this is just making it so that this material is super rigid in the red areas and not very rigid in the middle. Cool. Vellum solver time. think for this it was pretty straightforward. I believe I pretty much just had, I think I had 6 sub-steps in the end. Probably get away with 4. We turned our gravity off, so we had no gravity. I believe I made the friction, yeah, I made the friction, the threshold smaller, so it's more, and then I turned this to 0.5. These were just the settings that I found looked best. And in advanced, this is an important one. I switched this to first order, and I believe that is that. Yeah. I did also, I think when I first did this, I ran into ground position, right? Yeah, we want ground position on. I did lower this a tiny bit, just because. I mean, you probably don't need to with the pin group, and that's probably way too much. But I did, just because. Probably not a big thing. I did up this to 6 sub-steps. And yeah, let's sim this and we'll get back. Yeah, version 8. Okay, cool. Version 8. Okay, let's play. Another thing, when you are, I'm obviously just reading from a previous cache, but when you do file cache this, delete your attributes. So I always tend to do the ones I want to keep. So I do, if you want to keep your mask for rendering, if you're going to render with the strength mask, keep your mask. I normally keep position, UV, although technically we don't need to keep our UV or our normal, because we're going to be taking them from our high res geometry. But if you want to, you can keep these. If you're just like caching a straight full res, you can. Am I losing my mind? I can't see normal here. I guess we don't have a normal. Oh well. Yeah, and then so I do the ones I want to keep, and then I'll do star, and I'll just put an uptick on each of these. And you can just delete your groups. I delete all of them because I don't need any of them. But yeah, if you want to keep them, same principle applies. Just do your star and then uptick on the ones you want to keep. Yeah, and also only cache what you're simming. So for this, we only animate it to 75, so just cache 75 frames. And unless you're like gonna be retiming this and making it slower, you don't need sub-steps. Just keep this at 1. You only need this if you're gonna like slow a sim down, but in most cases, if you're gonna do that, you should just sim at a smaller time scale and then speed up, because then you don't have to worry about adding more sub-steps. Just means that you're going to be simming more frames, but I find that if you're going to be running it slower, your sim's going to look better anyway if you're simming at a smaller time scale. And then when you speed up, it's going to look pretty good. And you don't have to worry about interpolating and stuff like that. So that's what I'd recommend. After this, we can start moving into point deforming. And point deforming, when I first tried this node, I had struggled. Because I didn't really know what went into what input. But essentially what it is our simulation. So the points that we are deforming by go into here. The rest, so this is our same geometry from this side, this node set up, but before the sim. So you can either put it in here, I just put it in here because we don't need the attributes or the group. This is just our pre-sim mesh. right? And then the last one is our high resolution mesh. And we should, if it doesn't break, this is probably because I'm using a file cache that's not from this sim. So if I remove this, yeah, I have slightly different settings, but that's basically it. I probably have slightly different edge groups, but that's what we should get, right? And it should keep the whole way. So if I sim this, let me just cache this to disk. Okay, so I've just cached the sim. So as you can see, we've crushed it. This kind of crushes in a pretty interesting way. But the big thing here is with the point deform, sometimes it does this sort of stuff, right? Where you're getting intersections. And if you're not point deforming, you won't run into this problem. But if you are point deforming, the best solution to this is just play with these. See what it looks like with rigid projection on and off. I tend to, when I did mine, I liked it without. Just looked a bit better. But we just want to tweak this basically, right? This radius. So the smaller it is, the more accurate it is, and we just want to tweak it so that we get rid of those intersections. I don't really understand what the max points is. If someone knows what this does, because it didn't seem to affect this at all when I was doing it, and we have 9,000 points here. So, like, my instinct is to just set this to whatever our point maximum is. But when I did that, it didn't really change anything. So, yeah. But if anyone knows the scenario in which you would use that, because they had a comma. Yeah, if anyone knows a scenario where that is good to change, let me know, because I don't know why you would bother changing this. It doesn't change anything. It's mainly the radius. This is the one that you want to tweak and find that middle ground where you're keeping a lot of the detail and thingying. But be careful, don't go too low on this, because it does start making your sim look a bit jaggy and weird. So you really just want to find that sweet spot where you're just not intersecting anymore. For me, that's 0.032. And again, rigid projection. I find rigid projection off looks better. And that's it. You can, after this, you can do whatever post-processing you want to this. I tend to, if you really want more detail, subdivide this now. You've got a nicer looking mesh. Probably don't need to do that. If you do that, you can probably do it with the remesh. It's up to you. That is our Can Crush. And again, if you want it to look different, if you want it to crush in a different way, it's all in this mask. So whatever noise pattern you've got, whatever your mask attribute is, if you change that, you're going to get a completely different way of it going to crush. You can probably set up a wedge, like if you do a wedge setup, you can probably do that and just have this noise change in some way with your wedge to get you a bunch of different looks. Yeah, hope you enjoyed. Let me know if there's any tutorials you want to see, because at the moment I've got no more ideas. So if you guys want me to run through, I don't know, how I model in Houdini, how anything, just let me know. I will see. Okay, hope you enjoyed. Bye.